Howdy, I'm Tim, and welcome to the Mr. Maple Show.
Aloha, I'm Matt. Thanks for clicking on another Mr. Maple video.
Today we've got a great question we get all the time. Are Japanese maples easy to grow? And the answer is yes, Japanese maples are easy to grow, and we're going to give you 5 tips on growing Japanese maples.
So today we're going to cover 5 tips to give you more confidence and more success in gardening with Japanese maples. So we're actually going to start these at number 5, and we're going to end up at number 1 being the most pivotal step. So we hope this gives you some good advice and some good tips for growing Japanese maples.
Number 5.
So number 5 is weed eaters.
You got to watch out for these weed eaters during the summer. Oftentimes people will go out in the spring and the summer with weed eaters, and they'll actually strip the base of the tree with the weed eater. Whenever you strip the base of a Japanese maple or any tree with the weed eater, that plant can't get water and nutrients up the tree because you've stripped out the xylem that carries all that up to the top parts of the tree. So don't damage that. Make sure if someone's out there weed eating, you say, stay away from my Japanese maples.
Right. We wouldn't put it so high on the list at number 5 if it wasn't something we didn't see quite frequently. So make sure to be cautious of this. You know, if you have somebody weed eating for you, like last year I actually had a guy weed eating for me, and I went over it with him. I'm like, hey, I have a lot of really nice trees in this yard. You know, we have to be very careful if we weed eat up next to them. And that was all great until about the 4th time he come, and then he outsourced it to a guy who hadn't been there before. And that guy tore up some very young plants with a weed eater. So you have to be very careful with this. It's an easy mistake to make. The key there, and you know, a little bit of stripped is bad, but what you don't want is a complete stripping all the way around. And then you've girdled that tree, and it's going to be much harder for that plant to heal off from that point forward if it's been stripped all the way around. So be very conscious of weed eaters around young plants. It's an easy way to cause Japanese maples some, you know, irreparable damage that you can't fix. So just be conscious of that. And, you know, we put it over deer because it's the most common thing we see. We actually see more damages from people with weed eaters than we do, you know, external things like deer being an issue.
One of the best ways to avoid this is take a tomato cage, put around young small trees, and that means that they can't weed eat right up next to it, which means they have to stop and pull those weeds by hand. That's going to be one of the best ways to help avoid this issue of weed eaters that we see so frequently. And when you do that, that's going to make the Japanese maples much easier to grow.
So the tip for the weed eaters is lay out very clear parameters. If you have somebody else weed eating, you know, give them barriers, slow them down, make it harder for them to get to the base of your Japanese maple. Plan ahead because, you know, an ounce prevention can be worth a pound of cure. And so be ready for that. Go ahead and plan ahead so that you're not in a situation where your tree is getting girdled by a weed eater. Number 4. Number 4 would be weed killers.
Weed killers, we see this every summer. And you may have heard us talk about this in some of the general care for Japanese maples, but this is one of our top things we see. And when the season gets here for weed killer, you see it all across Japanese maples. People will start sending us photos and say, what's wrong with this? And everything else in the photo is dead too.
Yeah.
But the Japanese maple is what they're concerned about because that's the more expensive plant in the situation.
Yeah, we list this one pretty highly on our list. I mean, weed killers were coming up to, you know, you can almost schedule it on your calendar. You know that certain time of the summer when, you know, a lot of the lawn maintenance people are spraying weed killers, and you can kind of get ready for it. You know a lot of that Japanese maples are going to get affected by it. Now, a lot of people will say, hey, I didn't spray the tree. But what they might not be conscious of is that drift. So even spraying it near it can often get onto that fresh young foliage. We're getting weeds a lot of the same time as new foliage is flushing. And you can definitely see the difference when a Japanese maple has been hit with a little bit of weed killer. Everything's going to kind of shrivel up. It's going to be a regular size foliage. You're going to know instantly that something's wrong with your plant, and things may go downhill very quickly. So be very cautious of that. You want to avoid weed killers being sprayed, you know, in the vicinity of your Japanese maple. You don't want them very close to that at all.
If you read on the packaging for a lot of weed killers, 1, it says don't do it on windy days. 2, it says don't do it when it's above a certain temperature. If you do it when it's above that certain temperature, what happens is it actually becomes more gaseous and it can actually spread and drift easier. And so you may actually put it down below the tree and then it raises up around the tree and actually gets on the tree itself. So that's something to be very careful about. Make sure you're following the directions if you are putting out weed killer in your yard, or make sure that whoever's putting the weed killer out in your yard, make sure they're following those directions as well. Because just because they have a day to put it out doesn't mean that's the day you should put it out in your landscape.
This is true. If you have a prized Japanese maple in your yard, and you have someone spraying weed killer, you really can't be careful enough. I hate to create a situation where you follow somebody around and watch what they're doing, but you got to be really careful, because it definitely can be something that makes the Japanese maple go downhill very, very quickly.
And do you have a high grafted Japanese maple? People often go really close to the base on that and actually spray the trunk because they're trying to go so close and kill weeds around it. And we see this all the time with a high grafted lace leaf. You've got a beautiful high grafted lace leaf, and then the trunk starts getting spots on it after people have sprayed weed killer. Again, that's because some of that spray has got on that plant, be it drift or direct spray. And so I've seen this numerous times, and so I really hope you follow this advice, because Japanese maples are really easy to grow, but following these 5 tips will really help you grow Japanese maples very easily. Number 3
is fertilizing Japanese maples.
Yeah, that's one of the most important things when you're growing Japanese maples is the fertilizer. And people think about fertilizing Japanese maples, and we all fertilize Japanese maples to make them grow and perform well in the landscape. But often people over-fertilize their Japanese maples.
Yeah, you want to think about that distribution rate. Now, often people will say, well, how much should I use? And that varies per bag. So you're going to want to look at the instructions on whatever specific fertilizer you're using, because there are a lot of different distribution rates. The key there is not to go too high in nitrogen. We recommend a 15 or lower on that nitrogen. Too much nitrogen can certainly hurt a Japanese maple. If you're over pushing your Japanese maple, it's going to have harder winterization. It's going to open it up for late frost, and it's going to have more issues long term, especially on those winterization in those colder zones. Those zones 5 and 6 are going to be much more difficult if you're using too high nitrogen. But it also matters for that heat. We have a whole video on high heats, and your Japanese maple is just not going to be as well grown of a plant if it's over pushed.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Matt. For a lot of y'all that may just be getting into gardening, when you have those 3 numbers on a fertilizer bag, there's 3 numbers, a dash, there's a number, a dash, a number, a dash, and a number, and the very first number is that nitrogen. You're going to want something that's going to be that 15 or under on that first number, and then follow the rates that it says on that bag. One of the key things you have to do in fertilizing, though, is understanding how long that fertilizer is releasing. Some bags will be a 180-day release. You wouldn't want to put that out in the late season, because it wouldn't have 180 days until that plant is dropping leaves and going dormant.
Yeah, we actually stopped any fertilizing after May on granulated mixes, and that just kind of helps everything. It's one of the most commonly seen mistakes we make. We'll see a lot of people that will over push their Japanese maples, and what you're going to end up doing is, like those winter months, they're just going to be much, much weaker plants. It's much more open to disease and bacteria when it's over fertilized. 2. So next up on our list is another important thing for growing Japanese maples. Number 2 on our list is don't plant Japanese maples too deeply.
Yeah, this is an issue we see all the time, and you really don't start to see this until late in the summer, when you start to see the plant lose its vigor. You start to see it starting to struggle mid-summer, and it's because the plant's been planted too deeply out in the landscape and garden. Japanese maples like to have a lot of oxygen flow to the roots of the plant. And by making sure that you take that plant, you look and see where it's in the pot when you're going to plant it. You want that to be at the top of the soil, or even raised up a little bit when you're planting the tree.
Yeah, it's much better to plant your Japanese maple on a little bit of a berm than it is too deeply. You don't want it sinking down. It's better to raise the ground up around it than it is too deeply, but just flat is typically perfect. The key there is not too deep. When you get the Japanese maple too deep in the ground, those roots are going to shut down. The tree's going to have to re-root above that original soil layer. So you're going to create a situation where you're constantly needing to put on new roots to feed that Japanese maple. So what was bark is now becoming an area that has to put out feeder roots. And that's going to slow the tree down a lot, especially grafted Japanese maple. When that graft is buried below the soil, that tree's going to struggle, because you're basically creating a scenario where it's going to have to re-root constantly. Instead of putting on top growth and root growth, this tree's having to go into some other processes. So if you can avoid having the tree planted too deeply, you're going to get a much better growth rate on your Japanese maple, and a much better looking Japanese maple long term. And it's also going to be much more disease resistant.
And that brings into that topic of why the volcano of death is the volcano of death. I mean, if people keep piling mulch around that base of that plant, you're starting to smother that plant and making that plant go through those other processes of trying to put roots on to survive. And that's something you always want to avoid: mulching too deeply and planting too deeply, because this is going to make those plants struggle. And if you avoid those, it's definitely going to make it a lot easier to grow in your landscape and garden.
Number 1! So if you've watched any of our Mr. Maple videos before, you can probably guess what number 1 is. We say it in a lot of our videos because we think it is the most important tip for growing Japanese maples. So number 1 tip for growing Japanese maples is good drainage. Drainage is the key for Japanese maples, and once you get that right, so many other things are going to fall into place.
Putting a Japanese maple in a boggy, wet area isn't going to work. Either put it in a container, put it somewhere else, or put something else in that place besides of a Japanese maple, because Japanese maples don't like wet feet. You can always build up an area too to increase drainage to an area so the Japanese maple will do well in that area. But growing Japanese maple in an area that has poor drainage is a bad idea. It's not going to work well, and the plant's roots are going to get smothered. You're going to get almost phytophthora on the roots if it gets moisture all the time and it's not able to drain. And you can actually kill your Japanese maple with poor drainage.
Yeah, maple roots like to go and search that moisture. So we recommend having a situation where you can water them and let them get completely saturated and then dry out between waterings. So you don't want them sitting in standing water. That's going to be a way to shut your Japanese maple down very quickly. It's going to, create a situation where you're not getting much growth, and you're also getting some root rot and other issues. It often leads to any of the diseases you can see in Japanese maples because they've stayed too wet, especially in those winter months. So be very conscious of that. Be conscious if the water has changed in your yard at all, and just be very conscious of that overall. I'll see people that'll put Japanese maples in their drain pipe. You got to be careful there. If you have really good drainage, it may work, but if you're in an area that's going to get a ton of water, there may be a specific year where that's holding and staying too wet too long. So just be conscious of that. It's better to be raised up. You can raise a bed and create that drainage in an area that's wetter. You can put it in a container and leave it above the container, above the soil level. If that area is too wet, those are ways to get around that. But too wet, honestly, just doesn't work.
And you can cause this too wet situation when you have good drainage just by constantly watering and never letting that plant dry out. We've seen everything that can go wrong with Japanese maples. Well, almost everything. And we're seeing
Never say everything with plants. There's always something different.
But if you follow these 5 tips for growing Japanese maples, they are extremely easy to grow. So I hope this video gives you confidence in growing Japanese maples. And if you've never grown a Japanese maple before, gives you confidence in trying them out.
Hey, put your top 5 tips for growing Japanese maples in the comment section below. That's a great way for us to build this community, have a conversation with you, and just keep the conversation going. So let us know what you think the top 5 tips for growing Japanese maples are in the comment section below. As always, that's just the beginning of the conversation. We look at those comments, we try to interact with them, and we look for ideas for future videos as well. So we hope this helped you today. God bless.
And have a great day.